Hi, and welcome to this close-up mini-lecture on the city through history. Here we look at how cities have morphed from one thing to another through human history, from the ancient to the postmodern world. Most of us implicitly think of cities as a modern phenomenon, but they are in fact quite ancient. Early cities, the first of which emerged 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in what we now call the Middle East, were primarily administrative and religious centers. Some of the earliest city-states emerged in the fertile plains shown on this map, bordered on one side by the Tigris River and on the other by the Euphrates. Some of the territory shown here is part of modern-day Iraq, and the ancient city of Babylon was located about 85 kilometers south of contemporary Baghdad. The typical location of an early city was no mistake. First and foremost were fertile valleys with the potential for accumulating an agricultural surplus and thereby feeding a lot of people. The early cities were also made possible by technological innovations such as irrigation, the ability to fashion metal implements such as plows, and the capacity to store the harvest. And we find evidence of the first literacy from the archaeological record of these early cities. As you can see from this list, some of the cities of the ancient world were quite large, considering they existed in a time long before electrical power, sewage systems, or water treatment. By the same token, there were limits to the growth of the early city. One issue alone is the task of supplying the inhabitants of a city with food, pretty daunting in an era before any mechanized transportation. This is one of the reasons why the early city was only capable of supporting a small percentage of the population in a region without facing catastrophe. We now know that the ancient Sumerian city-states collapsed partly because of the gradual buildup of salts in the lands they irrigated, a crucial flaw they hadn't accounted for in their otherwise brilliant engineering of their environment. Similarly, Canadian scholar Thomas Homer Dixon argues that Rome fell in part because its ecological footprint, its demand for human labor and natural resources, simply became too bloated. The last issue, of course, is the potential for epidemics when people live in densely populated areas without proper sanitation. The Black Death of the Middle Ages is a sobering example. We now jump ahead to the industrial city that began to emerge by the end of the 1700s. In other words, the city transformed by the Industrial Revolution. These are larger cities than those of the ancient world, more complex and differentiated. And where they first emerged, in Great Britain, for example, they rapidly became engines of growth. Most of the factors behind the emergence of the industrial city are technological. Advances in the use of fertilizer catalyzed the explosive growth of agricultural output, and the invention of rail transportation made it much easier to feed larger cities. Finally, the emerging industrial sector both depended on and supported the urban population. We jump ahead now to the kind of city that emerged in the years immediately following the end of the Second World War, especially in North America. Dubbed the post-industrial or the corporate city by sociologists, this is a radical reimagining of the city around the project of economic growth. Here we can see that post-war urban growth proceeds not in concentric circles as the Chicago School had proposed, but focused around multiple nodes, as is depicted in the multiple nuclei model of cities, shown here and described on page 417 of your textbook. The growth of suburbs is also a distinctive feature of the corporate city, beginning in the 1950s. Located outside of urban areas, suburbs were organized around the needs of middle-class families and were made possible by the post-war economic boom and the falling price of automobiles, which was important because car ownership was a central assumption behind the suburban developments. Suburban life was also heavily promoted as a cultural ideal. To have one's own house with a car in the garage was a tangible symbol of success. We come finally to some of the emerging features of cities today, which some sociologists have brought under the singular label of the postmodern city. Why is this? Up until relatively recently, a city could be said to express a single way of life. One could be a typical Torontonian, for example. Now, a large city is more like an assemblage of separate but coexisting communities, a feature that has been largely catalyzed by immigration and globalization. There also tends to be less clearly defined public space. One of the few things that is clearly delineated is the line between the haves and the have-nots. One final note about the inequalities of the postmodern city. In complete opposition to the predictions of the Chicago School, Toronto's downtown core has not become a decaying ghetto. Instead, as this map shows, less privileged groups, shown in red, are being pushed to the outskirts over time, leaving most wealthy Torontonians, shown in bright blue, in leafy downtown neighborhoods and with the best access to subway lines. Thanks for listening in. Make sure you've also checked out this week's lecture on urbanization.